Hello, welcome to another edition of Prove All Things. Want to thank everybody who's joining us today, whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or X, or on the CGI Digital Network app, whether that's on your phone, tablet, or television. We thank you for joining us, and to all those listening to or watching this as a podcast, we thank you for joining as well. I am joined with co-host Mike James. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, Jeff, doing well. Good to see you there. I guess we should let the folks know this is a pre-recorded edition of Prove All Things, but that's okay. But we just want to let them know that.
Yeah. We recorded this about a month in advance, so we're a little bit behind on whatever news may be out there. But other than that, how are things going with you, Mike?
Things are going pretty well, and looking forward to the new year. We're in February now, and I'm in the midst of teaching a class with Common Faith Academy. And actually, we're going to get a little deeper into that today with our guest. But what's new with you, Jeff, here in early February?
Yeah, right now, we're recording this about a month before this. So right now, I'm just watching the weather because we're in as of recording time. There may be some snow coming in to the Atlanta area, and I know I saw in the news this morning there's a lot of wildfires out where you're at, Mike.
Yeah, it's devastating, Jeff. I've been watching some of the local news coverage here in January here in Los Angeles, and there's some devastation in some parts of Los Angeles itself, not out in the woods around Los Angeles, but actually famous places like Malibu, Pacific Palisades, Altadena. Our church is very close to Altadena, where we meet in Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And some of that fire has gotten down into northern Pasadena. And it's just devastating what the winds are doing with those embers. The 80, 90 mile per hour winds last night just blew embers all over the place. And the fires are still going. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. And again, we're doing this a month later. Hopefully, but in a month from now, things will have been settled and all. I guess we'll know. All right, we're going to go ahead and bring in our guest, who's coming to us from Australia. How you doing, Tom?
Hey, Tom.
Good, thanks. Mike, I was fascinated by you talking about wildfires. We, like California, have wildfires as well, but for us, they're in the middle of summer or early fall. To have them in the middle of winter, no, we don't have fires then.
Yeah, this is out of the fire season. It usually ends around November here, but again, it's just an unbelievable occurrance right now.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, if you could give the people maybe some background of who you are, where you're from, before we get started here.
Okay. You interviewed me back on 29th of May, and I went into some detail then, so I'll give it more of a summary this time. Actually, by trade, a chartered accountant. I retired over 10 years ago now, worked in various multinational companies and chartered accounting firms and local government, various sales and marketing at one stage. So I live about 30 miles north of Melbourne on a small sheep farm. My wife and I actually grew up on sheep farms, and we have a farming background as well. So I used to farm at the weekends or on Sundays or on holidays and so forth. And yet I was also working in high finance. So it was a bit of a variety. Mm-hmm. Wore two hats. Church-wise, as a teenager, actually, I heard the World Tomorrow program with Garnett and Armstrong. That got me interested in the church. Attended my first feast in 1975 and stayed in the Worldwide Church of God to 1995. And as you all know, there was a bit of an earthquake in the church in 1995. And I left the Worldwide because I didn't go along with the so-called new teachings, which weren't new to me at all. They were just recycled old ones that I'd disproven many years earlier. Spent the next 20 years with one of the larger Church of God groups that came out of Worldwide. and then left them about 2015, and now really just an independent person, I suppose. It wasn't over doctrine, by the way, why they left them. And the last couple of years I've been associated with CGI, really. We've been to the CGI for the last 2 feasts, and we went to the UK both times. Fantastic feast. We really like the way CGI runs things. So that's really my background.
All right, great. Again, it's good to have you here with us again, and we're definitely looking forward to your presentations you have prepared for us.
Good.
Just let me know when you're ready to get started.
I'm ready.
All right, so I'll go ahead and pull it up. There you go.
Have you got my questions I sent you?
Do you have the questions, Mike?
Anyway,
probably in a note somewhere. Did you want to? Do you have them nearby, Tom?
I sent you to a list of questions you can ask me. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
Well, let's talk about what got me interested in the Exodus plagues. And it all started back in 2011 when I saw this blog by a man called John Carmack. It was called Church of God Perspective. And he said in this blog that the reason that he talked about the Exodus plagues and how the plagues were actually an attack on the gods of Egypt. And that got me interested. And if you just put the first slide up there, you can see that it says in Exodus 12:12, God was against all the gods, I will execute judgment. Now, the Egyptians had hundreds of gods. They had many, many gods. And God here was saying, I'm going to execute judgment against them. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. So I did some research in it, and eventually I put together a sermon message, which I gave in 2014 at that mainstream Church of God group that I talked about. And then later in 2018, I gave it again at the independent group I was attending at the time. And around about 2019 or so, I was helping Dusty and Dan Howe with Common Academy. And what I was basically doing was I was a tester for their courses, and I do a course and give them feedback on what worked, what didn't work, and so forth. And I sent them a video of this sermon and said, do you think this could be turned into a course? And they encouraged me to do it. So I started to put it into a course. And when I started to do that, I realized that a 50-minute sermon does not do this subject justice. There are just so many layers that God is attacking the whole culture of Egypt. And it's, to me, absolutely fascinating how God does this and how he uses the Egyptian culture against them. And so it's now a 7-part course.
That's very, very interesting. Did you look into the history of the Israelites, the interaction with Egypt for this course?
Yes, I did. One of the purposes of the course here is to really strengthen people's faith, to help them defend their faith. Like Mike talked about the course that he's running at the moment on comparative religions. And, a lot of people say, oh, all the religions are the same. Well, in fact, they're not. As Mike knows, the Christian religion has some differences to the others, and our version of that, the Church of God version, we have some very unique things that make us, and they're not just unique doctrinally, but they actually help our faith. They are very encouraging, they're very positive, they're very good differences. So likewise with this, it's very easy to just read over this and say, oh, it's just like a fairy tale. People just don't really realize it. But when you look at it, my purpose here is to understand the wisdom and power of God. And it really brings it out when you understand the culture of Egypt, how God's dealing with them.
I did find the questions, Tom, and I just sent them to Jeff. But one of them is, what extent you did some background research into this, if you could get into that.
Yeah. So I did lots of background research on this, and looked at all sorts of academic stuff, but I always looked at it from the biblical point of view. In fact, the course that I run is Bible first, history and culture, and archaeology second. In other words, it's not a course on Egypt as such. It's as it interrelates to this story. And one of the things that comes out of it is the power of God, the wisdom of God, but also the humor of God. In fact, at one stage, God actually says, I'm toying with the Egyptians. It's literally what the Hebrew means. So, God's in charge. And I think it gives us encouragement in our faith. We live in this secular world, and sometimes you can think, well, where's God? He doesn't seem to be doing much. But in fact, God is there in the background really doing things. And one of the interesting things about the way God does things, and I see this all through the Bible, and this story also brings it out. God is a delegator. He doesn't do everything himself. He delegated the role to Moses. Now, God's got all the power in the world. He could have just destroyed Egypt or whatever, but he did it through a human means. Now, Moses didn't do the miracles as such, but he did it through human means. And if you think about, it's just like preaching the gospel. God could stand on top of Mount Everest and boom out over the whole world and preach the gospel, but he doesn't. He delegates it for us to do. Now, he does the miracles and the things in the background, but he delegates. And I find that very encouraging, because that also tells me when we get into the kingdom of God, we won't be robots. We'll actually be utilizing our talents and developing things and working with God and with the rest of the spirit beings to do things. And I think that's really exciting, much more exciting than playing harps on clouds or something.
I agree. Jeff,
Okay.
were you able to see those questions?
Yeah, I got the questions here.
Okay.
So I may have my own questions as well to ask you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I just give you a bit of an outline of the course there.
Yeah.
So one of the purposes of the courses is to see God's work at hand, to understand that, how we can apply the lessons to today. And this is one of the problems perhaps we have. People may read these stories and they sound like fairy tales. They seem even weird, some of the things that happen. But they actually have a lot of relevance today. And in the course, we actually draw that out as well.
Okay.
Because there are lots of lessons for us as well.
All right, great.
So you asked, did I look at the history of this? Well,
yes.
As you know, there's a lot of interaction between the Israelites and Egypt going right back to Abraham's time before you even get the Israelites. Abraham went down to Egypt. So there is this interaction. I actually start the course off with Joseph. That's the starting point, because I think what happens with Joseph sets the scene for what happens later on. And one of the things I suggest, and I say suggest because in a minute as we go through this, you'll see there's a lot of grey areas in this. It's not all black and white. And so one of the things I do in the course is encourage students to have their own ideas. But one of the things I suggest that Joseph was assimilated into Egyptian culture. He became, if you like, Egyptianized. In fact, for example, he married, and Pharaoh organized this marriage, he married the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Now, that's important because the priests were very, very powerful in Egypt. They were second in power to the royal family. So by marrying Joseph into this priesthood, he was really cementing Joseph's power in the eyes of the Egyptians, because he was now in this royal family. Now, Joseph's wife's, her name means the worshipper of Neith, or belonging to Neith. So if we just go to the next slide here, that's the goddess Neith. And you might notice on its head there's a shield and two bows. And this goddess was a goddess of war and also a goddess of negotiation and solving disputes. So Joseph's wife was named after this goddess. And his father-in-law was a priest of the sun god Ra. And Ra was one of the major gods of Egypt. So he's marrying into this very pagan, very priesthood sort of family. So you can see how that influence happens. Now, in the course, I contrast this to Joseph's father, Jacob, because you might remember there was a really bad drought, and eventually Jacob and Joseph's brothers come into Egypt, and that's the beginning of Israel living in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacob's reaction to Egypt is the exact opposite of Joseph's. Jacob resists Egypt all the way, where Joseph becomes assimilated. Now, of course, we know in Hebrews 11, Joseph's praised Moses out of Egypt. So I'm not saying he didn't end up doing the right thing, but what I am saying is he did assimilate. And I'll give you an example of this. It's so easy to read over. If we go to the story, just move this slide along. Why isn't the next slide? Yeah. Oops, one too many. Okay, here we have the Pharaoh called Joseph. You might remember he was in the dungeon. He'd been locked away. He'd had these dreams. And so what did Joseph do? It says he shaved and changed his clothing. Now, it's very easy to read over that. In fact, I would argue, why was this even recorded? I mean, if you two were invited to visit the United States, and I said, oh, you had a shave and got dressed and wore a suit and tie and got a shower, I don't think that would pass the editing table, except perhaps for you, Jeff, because you've got a beard, and that's
yeah.
But why would it write this? What's so special about having a shave? Well, let me show you why I think that's important. This is Tutankhamun, and he's there on the middle, riding the chariot. Now, there's a lot of things you can learn from this photograph, but I'm going to concentrate on one thing. This is found in his tomb. It's actually on a box, and there's a painting on a box. Now, if you look at the Egyptians there on the left, right, and if you look at the men they're fighting, the people that aren't Egyptian, they're on the right. Now, look closely at their faces. Can you see what's different in their faces? What's different?
They have beards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Egyptians are clean shaven. The men they're fighting have got beards. And if you look at Egyptian photographs, hang on, how do I go to the next one here? Go back. Oh, yeah, that's right. If you look at Tutankhamun here, now that beard you see there is a false beard. It's made of goat's hair. He's got a clean shaven face, right? If you go, but it's just not him. If we go to the next slide when it goes, here you can see workers, and notice they're all clean shaven. Now they've got wigs on in this case, but they're all clean shaven. If you look at the next slide, here's workers again, and you can see they're clean shaven. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner there, I want you to notice notice how this one is holding a rod. You right remember how Moses got into trouble because the taskmaster was beating people? Well, there's a taskmaster with a rod, which I find interesting. Now, contrast this to people that weren't Egyptian. For example, this is a Syrian mercenary. So he's not an Egyptian, but he's living in Egypt. Notice he's got a really thick beard here. He's got long hair, which is actually held in place by something around his head there, a band around his head. So he had a beard. Here, on the next slide, these are Assyrians. Notice they've got heavy beards and long hair. So what this is suggesting is Joseph, it's just not a normal shave and normal getting dressed. He is trying to look like an Egyptian. So he's shaving off his beard, he's putting on Egyptian clothes so he can blend in with the Egyptians. And I'm sure you all know the story that when the brothers come to see Joseph, and this is a little over 20 years since they last saw him, and the last time they saw him, he was, about 17 or 18 or something, and they don't recognize him. Now, there was 20 years gap, a bit over 20 years, and of course they never expected that Joseph would be in this high position in Egypt. But I'm also suggesting that they didn't recognise him because he didn't have a beard. Now, I've had this happen to me a couple of times in life, in my work career, where I've worked with someone that had a really bushy beard, and one day they shaved it off, and boy, did they look different. I barely recognised them.
I know that with my beard, I definitely look different without the beard, so I can understand that. And I guess also, did they not Egyptians wear like makeup and stuff too? So maybe he was wearing makeup.
Yeah, they may have worn a bit of makeup. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm suggesting that this is the reason why they did not recognize, not the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons why they didn't recognize him, because you just look so different when you don't have a beard compared to having a beard.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So that's an example of how you can just read over things if you're not careful.
Yeah, I mean, I've read that verse and I just thought, okay, he shaved, and that was it. I didn't really think much past that, so I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah, there's a lot in the Bible like that. Yeah.
Now, I mean, these things are not salvational, whether you understand this or not. But I think if you understand Egyptian culture, it just really makes the Bible alive. It's not just a fairy tale when you understand their culture. These things could really have happened because it all makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess hopefully we live like how many centuries after this? Like, a lot. We live in modern times, and I guess it's hard for people to relate to this in our modern times, I would think.
Yes. Right. Your next question was, how do we understand the events of Exodus in the 21st century? Now, quite frankly, a lot of the Old Testament, and this is really a typical example, is actually weird to our sensibilities. I mean, there are snakes and rods changed into snakes and water into blood and frogs all over the place. I mean, what happens in these plays sounds really strange, let's be honest, to our today. And it can almost seem improbable. It's like a fairy tale. It's, you can just read over this superficially and not take much notice of it. And you've got this powerful, despotic ruler, the Pharaoh. And why would he listen to an 80-year-old shepherd? Why not just kill Moses or put him in prison? No, he puts up with him. Why? Now, Egypt had this incredible, powerful army, and all the chariots and everything else. How big an army did Moses have? He didn't have anything. So Moses had absolutely no power physically, if you look at it. So, but instead, to our eyes, we have all these weird miracles. How does it make sense? Well, in fact, there's many layers when you really study it where this all happens.
Yeah, well, not only why would Egypt listen to him, why would the Israelites follow Moses? I mean, the Ten Commandments gives you some reasons, but not everything in that movie was accurate.
That's for sure. Okay, well, how did God get someone? Remember, Moses had been away from the Israelites for 40 years. He was a shepherd out in the land of Midian. Yeah. So why would they do it? Now, if I was God, I don't obviously think like God, I'd have some powerful miracle with angels and, lightning, and I'd soon get their attention. But God doesn't do that. In fact, if we go back to the slides, we'll see that Moses himself is unsure how to do this. As you know, Moses makes excuse occasionally, but it's probably a pretty good reason, because Moses says to God, suppose they don't believe me I'm from you. How are they going to believe this? Why? Who am I?
Right.
And then God gives what to our eyes is a strange thing to do. Because he says, the Lord says, what have you got in your hand? And he says, a rod. Now, what that rod is, or a staff, it's a shepherd's staff. And, it has a wooden pole with a hook on the end. There's a modern one, but it's basically the same fashion as Moses would have had. And I'm sure you all know the story, but what happens is God says, throw it on the ground, became a serpent, became a snake, and Moses fled from it. And I tell you, I would too.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if someone had a wooden stick and they threw it in the ground and became a rattlesnake, I'm sure you two would run, right? I know I would.
Absolutely.
Hey, is there any symbolic significance that was the first miracle with
Yes.
Moses and the Egyptians?
There's a lot to this. And as
I never
we go
thought of
through
that, you know.
there is a very good reason for this, but we'll go through about this. So he says, as you all know the story, what he then says is, well, pick it up by the tail and it goes back to a rod. Would you grab hold of the tail of a rattlesnake?
Only if God told me to. Then I would.
I mean, it's a scary story, but it's also, I put it to you, a weird story. Why would, and it makes you think, well, why would that impress the Israelites? And you know, later on, it also happens in front of the Pharaoh. Why? And later on in the story, I'll tell you why this is so important when you understand Egyptian culture. So there's one of the snakes that are in Egypt. Would you grab hold of that? That's a desert horned viper, they call that creature. Here's another one. This is a different type of snake in Egypt. This is a Sinai cobra. Ooh. So I don't know what sort of snake Moses was dealing with, but you've got to imagine.
I've always imagined a cobra, but that's just my imagination.
I know there is a cobra in Egypt, and we'll come to that in a minute. But there are other snakes. That's what I'm pointing out.
Right.
So God says they will believe you if you do this miracle. And there are two other miracles that God gets him to do. One is he puts his hand in his coat and turns the leprosy, and he then takes out and healed. And another one is he turns water into blood, which is interesting because that is one of the plagues. But here, this is the first of the miracles. Now, you've got to think about how come this impressed the Israelites? Are they steeped in paganism too? And think about that as we go through. So, as you know the story, we'll move on a bit. He goes and does these miracles, including this snake miracle in front of the people, and the people are all for him. Now, we got your back, Moses. We're happy. Come, go out there. Let's get out of here. They're very, very positive. These miracles do the trick. But as you know, and we've all read the story, the Israelites are very fickle. And now this idea of backing Moses doesn't last long. The first bit of trouble, they change, as you probably know. So this happens. So this is how he convinces the Israelites. Okay. Now, he's convinced the Israelites, but how then does he convince the Pharaoh? How does he convince the Pharaoh? What happens? Well, if we go to the next scripture, the very next verse, and remember, this is an 80-year-old shepherd going to approach this powerful ruler.
Yeah.
And it says in chapter 5, very next verse, afterwards, after convincing the Israelites. So it gives the impression this is straight after. It's either the same day or the next day. In other words, boom. Now, I've done the miracles. The Israelites are all for me. Let's get the show under the road, right? That's what it says. And then, as you know, Moses and Aaron's the spokesman for Moses at this stage.
Yeah.
He says, thus the Lord God of Israel, let my people go. We may hold this feast. But what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh's very contemptuous. He says, now, who's this God? Who's Lord? I've never heard of him. You know, I've got thousands of gods. I haven't heard of this God. Now, who are you, Moses? Why should I listen to you? However, there's something here you may not realize unless you really compare it. Notice what God told Moses and Aaron to say originally. They did not say it to Pharaoh the way they were told. Because if we go back to Exodus 3:18, God says what you are to say. And if you compare these two, they're different.
Okay.
Subtle differences, but they're very important differences. Because Aaron, on behalf of Moses, says to Pharaoh, the Lord God of Israel. But God told them to say the Lord God of the Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that may seem the same to you, but actually it means different things. Because the word Hebrews is a bit like saying a barbarian. It's a sort of very broad genetic term, where if you say Israel, it's a political and religious term. In other words, Moses and Aaron on his behalf is saying to Pharaoh, Israel, in other words, the nation of Israel, not these Israelites that happen to be living in Egypt that are actually really Egyptians, just like people of Greek or Italian descent may be living in a country. He's talking as though this is a separate country. So you can imagine how that's going to get Pharaoh's hackles up. He doesn't say it like God said.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is God said to say that has met with us. In other words, they're supposed to say that God met with us and this is what he wants us to say. They don't tell Pharaoh that. So how does Pharaoh know that? They could be making this up. He hasn't been told that their God directly communicated this. So that's something else they miss out. The third thing they miss out is God says, when you go to Pharaoh, say please. In other words, it's a request. Please let us go. But they go in there, really barging in very arrogantly, very full of themselves. Let's get out of here and let us go. God says to be a bit more subtle. Ask it as please. Another difference.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's yet another difference. God says, let us go 3 days' journey. So from this, if they'd said that, Pharaoh would have worked out, okay, it's 3 days to get there, 1 day to have their feast, 3 days to get back. They're going to be away a week, right? Mm-hmm. They do not indicate anywhere how long they're going to be away.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually muck up God's original instruction. They don't do it the way God said it was done. They got carried away with the Israelites all supporting them. The Israelites were probably clapping, They got a swelled head there. They forgot out the instruction that God said this is going to be hard and Pharaoh's going to be difficult and all that. And so
perhaps they were nervous in front of the Pharaoh and kind of forgot, because I know I probably would be nervous in that situation.
Yes. And that could be true, Jeff, because if they're 80-year-olds and he's a powerful 40-year-old, presumably, or something.
Yeah.
I'm not discounting what you're saying, but is it possible also that the writer just left out some details?
It's possible, but if he left out, but the words are different. God of Israel is different to God of Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, I get that one for sure. I
don't think so, because if you go to the next verse in chapter 5, they get it right this time. They say, so the Pharaoh rejects them, and now they say, oops, what do we get wrong? Now they say the God of Hebrews met with us, please, 3 days' journey. They now say it the way God says. But they had something. They can't help themselves. They don't follow the instruction exactly. They say, lest he fall upon us with pestilence and sword. Mm-hmm. Now, think about that statement. How does that place God? How does that show God to be, that statement?
Negative, in a negative light.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. In fact, I reckon they're close to breaking the commandment not to use God's name in vain here, because they're making out that God is this awful, vicious God that's going to destroy his own people or cause them trouble, even though it's not their fault they can't leave. So it doesn't place God in a good light at all. I agree with you totally. But why do you think they said it? Why do you think they said it to Pharaoh? Why were they trying to use this as leverage to Pharaoh? What do you think?
They wanted to get him to agree that he didn't want to lose his slaves, so they would be back or something.
I think you're getting close to it, Mike. The slaves were a key part of the Egyptian economy. They were cheap labor, so they could build all these fancy buildings and do all this sort of stuff.
Right.
So they're saying, if you lose these people, it's going to affect your economy. You're not going to get all these cheap buildings built anymore. So that's, I think, the Bible doesn't say. You can see here, there's a lot of grey here, how you interpret it. But I'm trying to think what could the possible reasons be. And I think that may well be the reason.
Yeah, I guess if they present it as a loss of property, specifically to him, that he could be concerned.
Now, of course, with this story, you all know how it goes. And, of course, the Pharaoh really rejects it. He just treats Moses and Aaron here with contempt, really. He says, as you know, get back to work. And as you know, he ratchets up the work and they're not given straw and everything. So the whole thing falls flat. They got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. But, and of course, what happens is the Israelites complain. As I said, they're fickle. Originally, they were all for Moses. Let's get out of here. You've got our back. We're really happy. And now things get a bit tough, and now they're complaining. And then Moses goes to God and he says, you have brought trouble on this people. Moses does not even acknowledge that he's an Israelite here. He's talking about Israelites as they're totally separate to him. This people, not my people, not us, on this people. And then he says, why have you sent to me? The whole thing's problem. Now tell me, there's someone else before Moses' time who said something similar. Who does this remind you of?
Noah.
Yes, but someone else right at the start. What did Adam do? Adam said,
yes,
things went wrong in the garden. The woman made me do it. And he said, the woman that you gave me. In other words, Adam basically was blaming God for giving him Eve. Now, you might remember when he first got Eve, he was over the moon because he had this beautiful young wife. Wow, fantastic. But then when things go wrong, he blames Eve because, God, you made Eve for me. And here Moses is doing the same. He's basically blaming God. It's all your fault, God. Why have you sent to me? He's forgotten the instruction that was going to happen through plagues and everything. Why? He's blaming God.
I see that connection, yeah.
Okay, so, but as you know the story, something happens. He gets another bite. And God, at no stage does God criticize Moses for what he says here or say to Moses, well, it's all your fault because you didn't say it the way you meant to in the first place.
Yeah.
Chapter 7,
do you think if he would have said it the way God meant, the Pharaoh would just let him go? Or
well, originally Moses was told that the Pharaoh would be hard and he would exercise judgment against the gods. So obviously, no, he wouldn't have let them go.
Right.
But I think, God's wise. God probably knew that, may well have known, Moses was going to get a bit of a swelled head and not do things properly. I don't know. But, prophecy had to work. So God was going to work it out. He was going to have to discredit the Egyptian gods because if they just left then that wouldn't have happened.
Right.
So now we see something very interesting because in chapter 7, God says, I have made you as a god to Pharaoh. Now, this is where that's a strange thing to say. Very strange thing to say to our eyes. But this is a key and where you need to understand how Egyptians worked. Because the Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh was a god. And the Pharaoh's role was to communicate to all these hundreds of gods they got, to keep the gods happy, to keep them benevolent, so they got the flood at the right time and their crops grew and everything else. Because the Egyptians had this belief that the world came out of chaos. And it's interesting how Satan duplicates things, because you might remember in Genesis, the world was in chaos and then God recreated it. So they believed the world was in chaos, and these gods kept chaos at bay and they kept things going. And the Pharaoh had to communicate to these gods to keep them happy so everything was fine. So if Moses is going to appear as a god to Pharaoh, what else does that make Moses into Pharaoh's eyes? and makes him a rival pharaoh
Right.
because he's in the same role as Pharaoh. He's
He
a
makes some
god,
competition, I guess.
communicating to gods. He's like a pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
And I put it to you, this is why Pharaoh never tried to kill Moses, never threw him into prison. There was only one time when he threatened Moses' life, and that was in the 9th plague, and it was a pretty hollow threat at that.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not going to put Moses in jail because him and all these entourage, because these miracles are done in front of the court, so it's not just privately with Pharaoh. He's seen as a god. We've got to be a little bit careful with this man. He's a rival Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got the power of the gods on his side. So we can't, even though he hasn't got an army and he's old and all the rest of it, they can't deal with him. And it's very interesting because if we go to the next verse, or later verse, in verse 9, God says, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, show a miracle for yourselves. So unlike the first time he goes in there, there's no mention of miracles and he basically gets thrown out on his head, on his heels.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, Pharaoh is going to ask for a miracle. So why would Pharaoh want to ask for a miracle? Mm-hmm. Why that? I'm suggesting to you, by the time of this second visit, Pharaoh's spies had found out what had happened and found out about the miracles that that Moses had done in front of the Israelites. So now the Pharaoh wants to see those miracles, and in particular, the snake miracle. So at this point, I'm going to play you a video that gives you some background to why the Pharaoh might have wanted to see this.
All right. Let me go ahead and pull that up here.
Egyptian hieroglyphs are widely found in ancient pyramids, temples, burial chambers, and papyrus. However, for well over 1,000 years, the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics was lost. This all changed in 1799. Some of Napoleon's soldiers, as part of his military campaign in Egypt, discovered a large stone stele near the town of Rosetta. One of the soldiers realised its importance. The stone was inscribed with 3 languages of a decree issued in Egypt in 196 BC by King Ptolemy V. One language was in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but importantly, one was in Greek. Ancient Greek was well known, and this became the key to interpreting the hieroglyphs. The stone became known as the Rosetta Stone. It took 20 years to interpret the hieroglyphs. However, the meaning of some Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to baffle scholars. One of these is inside the Pyramid of Unas. Egyptian chronology is disputed, but this is one of the oldest surviving pyramids, possibly built in 2400 BC. In the early part of the 21st century, 2 codebreakers combined to decipher the text. Richard Rittner, Professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, wrote to fellow colleague, Semantic Languages Professor Richard Steiner of New York's Yeshiva University, asking whether any of the passages could be Semitic, not Egyptian. In 2007, Professor Steiner revealed the meaning of the text. Although written in Egyptian characters, the texts were composed in the Semitic language spoken by the Canaanites. Canaanite priests of the ancient city of Byblos in present-day Lebanon provided these texts to the kings of Egypt. The port city of Byblos was important to the ancient Egyptians. They imported timber for construction and resin for mummification. Not only did the Egyptians import physical goods from Byblos, they also imported magic snake spells. The text revealed that the Egyptians believed that snakes understood the Canaanite language. The Canaanite language is very similar to Hebrew and shares many words. Where did Moses live when he was in exile for 40 years from Egypt? In the land of Midian. And where was Midian located? Between Egypt and Canaan. Many believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible in Hebrew, a Semitic language, similar to Canaanite. Moses was from Midian on the way from Egypt to Canaan. Had Pharaoh heard about the staff into snake miracle that Moses, a Semitic speaker, had performed in front of the Israelites? We now come to Moses' second meeting with the Pharaoh. Notice what God says to Moses. When? Pharaoh says, show a miracle. This time the Bible indicates that Pharaoh wanted to see a miracle from Moses. And what miracle did Moses and Aaron perform? A snake miracle.
For a very good reason, because of the significance of the snake in Egyptian culture?
Yes. And in a minute, I'm going to really blow your mind about this because there is just so much to this. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the slides. So as we know in the story that Moses' rod, which Aaron probably did on his behalf, they swallowed up all these other snakes. You all know the story, right?
Right.
Now, I'm suggesting because Moses was coming from this area where these priests were that had these snake miracles, that may well have been the reason why Pharaoh wanted to see him, because he thought he may have some more information about these snake miracles, right? Mm-hmm. So you can see how God is using their culture and superstitious beliefs against them. Now, if you look here, rods were a common thing in Egypt. Now, here you have this military commander and he's holding a rod, right? So it's a quite common thing. If we look at the next slide, you can see the Pharaoh here is holding rod, one in the shape of a staff and the other one in the shape of a flax for beating grain. The next slide. Notice here the god on the left, the god Atom here, is holding a rod. So, so rods are a common thing for the Egyptians. But have a look at the next slide. I find this one's fascinating. Notice what they're holding here on the left there. They're holding snake rods. They're rods in the shape of a snake.
Yeah, they do look like snakes for sure.
So are you saying that before God asked Moses to do this miracle, they already had like snake rods? They were turning into snakes or something?
Yes. The whole thing, this is not unusual to the Egyptians. It's very weird to our 21st century eyes, but to the Egyptians, the whole idea of snakes and rods was integrated into their beliefs. So,
I always wondered why that particular miracle first, if the Egyptians could do it, but then the snake of Moses eats their snake. So I think that's symbolically significant.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess it probably would be very impressive to them if they were doing these little snake miracles for that snake to eat their snakes. That would be something else.
Yes. In fact, you might like to ask the question, why were the Egyptians so fascinated with snakes? Why was the snake miracle the key miracle that God asked them to perform? Well, Egyptians have this incredible relationship with snakes, ancient Egypt. And they had good snakes and bad snakes. And their bad snake was called a possus or a pep. And what it did is it used to attack the sun god, because they believe that's the sun god of that orange glow above his head there. They believed the sun would go through the sky, then at night it would travel in this boat at night, and this evil snake god would attack the sun god and try and stop him rising up next day. But of course, the sun god managed to overcome it with the help of that other god there spearing the snake. But he could never kill the snake. It always survived. And the red sunrise and red sunset, they believe, was the blood left over from this battle. And I won't get into it today, but you can imagine the darkness plague, how this would have affected their ideas. But at this stage, that's a bad snake. But they had good snakes as well. And you mentioned earlier, Jeff, about a cobra.
Yeah.
Well, if you look carefully, there it is, an Egyptian cobra.
I tell you what, to me, a cobra looks like the most impressive looking snake. I mean, they just have that they have their hood. They just look so like almost royal, regal. This kind of impressive display there.
Interesting you should say royal or regal, because if you look carefully at the pharaoh's headdresses, you'll see a cobra on the front there. See the cobra above his eyebrows there? That's a cobra.
Look at the headdress. The headdress of the figure there too looks like a cobra.
Yeah. Now they had a goddess called Wadjet that looked exactly like a cobra snake.
Oh, that's her.
And Wadjet's role was to protect the king. It symbolized that this was a legitimate king. It symbolized the sovereignty of the king. So she was an important goddess, and it's on Tutankhamun's headdress there. But you'll see other Egyptian, you'll see it's very common to be on the pharaoh's headdress, this Wadjet goddess. Now we'll go to the next slide. However, there's an even more interesting Egyptian god. Now, this god is not as well known because for some reason or other, he didn't have as much known about him today as Wadjet, and that's Nikabu, another snake god. Now, Nikabu's a very interesting snake god. Very interesting.
Nikabu there, you go back, he had like legs, right?
In that drawing he did, but he doesn't always. There he is.
It reminds me of like in the Garden of Eden. Yes. The snake had legs.
Yes. That's a good point, Jeff. They draw them different ways. Nikabu there is the third being up at the top there on the right, and you'll notice he's got a snake head and he's holding a staff there and he's sitting down. So there's this snake god called Nikabu, but this is where it gets fascinating. Nikabu's, according to Egyptian mythology, Nikabu restored snake bites. So if you got bitten by a snake, you'd appeal to Nikabu and he could heal you, so-called. Nikabu protected the king and other people in the afterlife. Nikabu was one of the gods that announced when a new pharaoh came. And here's where it gets really fascinating. In Egyptian mythology, Nikabu swallowed 7 deadly cobra snakes.
Wow.
Okay.
Interesting.
So now we begin to understand the mechanism by which God made Moses appear as a god to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Because
where are you getting? You're getting this information from Egyptian mythology research you did in that.
If you look up Rutledge's Dictionary of, I go into this in the course. If you look up Rutledge's Dictionary of Egyptian Gods, for example, on Nikabu, he specifically says that he swallowed 7 deadly cobra snakes. So now, and this god is associated with the king. So you can see how God could use that miracle to make Moses appear as a god to Pharaoh, because it's as though Nikabu has changed sides. He's now supporting Moses, perhaps.
Now I see that statement much more clearly. I will make you as a god, yeah.
Or perhaps he believes that Moses' God is more powerful than Nikibu because he swallows the snakes. And they believe that Nikibu got his power from swallowing these snakes. And that's
Right.
exactly what Moses' rod does.
Yeah.
I'll actually quote to you, this is the text from a coffin. So Egyptians used to put texts inside their coffins, inside their mummies, with spells to get them through the tests to get into the afterlife. And this is one of them. And it's about Nikibu. And it says Nikibu rules two lands, because Egypt had Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, sometimes there was a pharaoh in Upper Egypt at exactly the same time as there's one in Lower Egypt. So sometimes you had a pharaoh who was powerful enough to rule the whole of Egypt. So this spell is saying that Nikibu rules both lands. He's over both. Notice he grants souls and he grants crownings. So he crowns kings, right? And their lives are at my hand when I wish, I act, and they live. So here we have the mythology in Nikibu, and he's someone who crowns. So this, I believe, is how God helped the Egyptians see Moses as a god. It was through this miracle.
Interesting.
Yeah, again, I mean, I've always thought it was definitely an impressive miracle, but never had the background you're showing here. So it's very, very interesting.
I'm sure there are other tidbits like this in your course.
Hundreds of them. But what I'm saying is, when you understand Egyptian mythology and you overlay what you see in the Bible, you see how God is using their superstitious mythology against them.
Yeah, and that helps make the Bible even more reliable to the critics, I think,
Yeah, because the critics say that there was nothing that happened in Egypt. That's what the critics say. But this right here shows there's historical accuracy about what the Egyptians believed in this story. So, yeah.
Yes, and that's why I think, this course would encourage people with their faith. And if someone says to them, be ready to give an answer, that's all mysterious fairy tale. No. When you understand Egyptian culture, it all makes sense.
Right. Did you learn anything? Did you learn anything in your research that changed your mind? For example, when I first saw the Ten Commandments movie, before I read parts of the Bible, I thought that was what happened. Anything change your mind?
Absolutely. In fact, in a minute, I'll tell you 3 things that I changed my mind on, and you may be surprised at them, because it's not black and white in a lot of this, and you need to sort of work it out. But what happens is the Pharaoh heart grew hard. Now, some people have this idea, well, God must be awful because we had this nice man and suddenly he turns him hard. No. Pharaoh was hard from the word go. After all, his predecessors had killed little babies. And if you think about it, we have an expression in Australia that you bite off your nose to spite your face. Have you got that expression in America?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so if you think about the Pharaoh, how hard he was prepared to take the straw off the Israelites, so they had to work harder to punish them, even though that threatened his building projects. Because once you don't put straw in mud bricks, they are nowhere near as good a quality. They break down quicker. They're not as strong. So he was prepared to risk his own building projects to hurt the Israelites. This is a hard man. And he grew hard here. But also you've got to realize that the Pharaoh is in what we call a catch-22 situation. Because remember, Moses is now a rival Pharaoh. So if he gives in to Moses and does what Moses asks, then he's saying to everyone in Egypt, Moses is stronger than me. I'm giving in to Moses. That's what he's saying. On the other hand, he has this role of communicating with the gods and keeping chaos at bay and making sure everything goes right. And of course, every plague is a chaos. It's causing all these problems. So it makes him look weak. He's not doing his job. He's not keeping the gods happy. So he's got to give in, because if he doesn't, he'll lose following because he's not keeping the gods happy. But by giving in, he's showing Moses is stronger. So he's really in a catch-22 situation here, and he's getting harder and harder all the time.
Wow. Listen, we're getting close to the hour here. Could you tell us more about the course and how to get into it, and any final comments you want to make here, Tom?
Okay, so there's an awful lot more to go through. We'll have to go through it another time. I'm surprised. In practice, I thought this only take 50 minutes. The things that I could tell you about some of the things I changed my mind, but we don't want to go into that. Is that right?
Yeah, you know what? They could take the course, but we could bring you back after you run the course, and maybe we could talk a little more about it. But why don't you tell them a little bit about the structure of the course and how they could take it, if not this time, for another time possibly. But they can take it if they see this program, right?
That's okay. The course has got 7 modules, 1 per week. So what you do, a bit like your course as well, Mike, you do your own research and do the course material, and then once a week we have a Zoom meeting that goes for about an hour. So the first.
So is an hour only the time you have to devote to this, or some other outside studies?
I'd say I'd allow 2 to 3 hours a week to do the course material, but it also depends how much depth you want to go into. You could read fairly superficially about the Egyptian gods and get an idea what it's about, and you could probably get through it fairly quickly. Or if you're really, really interested, you could spend hours upon hours reading all about the gods. But if you want to understand it from the biblical point of view, 2 or 3 hours a week to do the course material. It's all online. You don't need to buy any material. It's all on the internet. And then you do.
It's not going to cost me anything to do this course at all?
No, this course is totally free. So we do module 1 as an introduction. Module 2, we look at the Nile river plagues, which is the first 3 plagues. Module 3, we look at how Israelites were spared the plagues. Module 4 has how the Egyptian economy was crushed. And module 6 is the aftermath of the plagues. And module 7 is how it applies today, modern Egypt, as I call it.
Very good, very good. And if they want to get involved, we put up the Common Faith Academy site there. Is that where they go, Tom, to get registered?
If you go into the Common Faith Academy account, in fact, course, if you type in Common Faith Academy in Google search, Common Faith Academy should come up, or if you can put it in down the bottom in the description. You'll go in there, you'll see your course at the moment, Mike, you'll see my course, and there's a whole lot of in there, but my course is in there as well, and log in your name, and there you go.
Yeah, and let me just say that if anybody has any trouble with that, you can shoot me an email, and I can help you with any questions as far as registering for courses, especially Tom's course here. There's my email. Just shoot me an email, and I could answer any questions if you're having trouble. Okay, well, listen, Tom, I learned a lot today. This was very fascinating. Thank you. And again, you did a sheep program, which was very fascinating. Also, you really bring up some really good nuggets of information.
Yeah. So is there a lot of good nuggets like this in your course?
Absolutely. For example, was the 4th plague flies or not? Were the Israelites miraculously did the Israelites suffer the first 3 plagues? Did the Pharaoh die in the Red Sea? There's so many things that you can look at. And there's so many layers to this. I haven't got time to talk about it. There's so much.
We're whetting their appetite, so that's what we wanted to do. So thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, again, thank you, Tom, for joining us this week. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we go?
Yes, the course is designed for participation. You don't have to agree with me on, for example, what I think the 4th plague was. The Bible's a bit vague. So you're more than welcome to have your opinion. So we encourage people to discuss it and come up with your own conclusions.
And that's what we do here on Prove All Things. Is definitely we like to bring ideas and talk about ideas, but sometimes we got to realize there are other ideas out there as well, and we got to look for the proof so we can decide on our own what is the truth and what is the best. And again, appreciate you being a part of today's program, Tom.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
we'll see everybody again next week on another edition of Prove All Things. So goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, Tom. Bye-bye.
Bye.